Hi, and good to be with you all for our next daily devotional as we continue in the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're focusing in on chapter 19, verses 10 through 12. So just 3 verses we're looking at today. But before I read these, I need to give some context to help understand what's going on, because when I read these 3 verses, you'll see that we're jumping into a conversation that's already been going on. So at the beginning of chapter 19, we see that the Pharisees are engaged in trying to test Jesus as they're having a conversation with him. And the conversation revolves around whether or not it's lawful to divorce. And in verse 9, Jesus makes not only a clear statement, but an authoritative statement when he says, "Whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." Now that statement is what's leading us into our verses for today. So beginning at verse 10, it says, "The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it." Okay, so right off the bat, let's admit, this is kind of confusing. Jesus is talking about a husband and a wife. He gives a clear statement on the only valid reason for divorce, which seems to cause the disciples to respond with despair on whether marriage is even workable, and then all of a sudden he starts talking about eunuchs. What's going on? Well, the first thing we should acknowledge is that it seems the disciples overreacted a bit with their response to Jesus. They respond to Jesus when he gives the only lawful grounds for divorce by saying, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. Basically, the disciples are saying, listen, if this is the only way out of a messy and unhappy marriage, then it's just way better not to marry. And Jesus responds to them by saying, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. In essence, Jesus is telling the disciples their statement has some truth to it, but not for everyone. The truth of their statement is only for those to whom it is given, namely eunuchs. Okay, so what is a eunuch? Well, biblically, a eunuch was a male who was either castrated or incapable of reproduction due to a birth defect. And then there were males who were eunuchs by title, meaning they chose a life of celibacy, either because they simply had no sexual desire or they wanted their life to be focused entirely on the kingdom. So Jesus is identifying 3 kinds of eunuchs, some who were born that way, some who were forced. Jesus addresses that when he says eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And lastly, those who voluntarily choose that kind of life. And I know some of you may be wondering, why would men force other men to be eunuchs? Well, in ancient times, this practice was actually pretty common. Rulers wanted to pacify and ensure their advisors and servants would be submissive, and this is one of the ways they did that. Rulers would especially do this for the men who tended and cared for the royal harem. And that's kind of self-explanatory, but going back to the disciples, our section today is really on how Jesus responds to their comment about the fact that it's better not to marry if you can only divorce over sexual immorality. And I think that comment in and of itself helps to give us a picture or a window on how the disciples viewed marriage. And that's a whole other devotional, but Jesus' response, it is true that there are some who can receive what you said, namely eunuchs. So let those who receive it, or who can receive it and live a life without marriage. So the principles of marriage that Jesus lays out here is pretty simple. Actually, applying them to real-world situations takes incredible wisdom because we are so messy as broken and imperfect people. What I know is that when difficult and complex situations arise, which is most often the case, we should never rush to judgment. The Lord takes divorce very seriously, which means we should never place a yoke on someone's back that Jesus himself never placed. But most of all, whether we're in marriage or thinking about getting married, we must remember that when we enter into this sacred covenant, it is meant to be for good. And we should do everything in our power to ensure we do nothing that would break and destroy this sacred union. A union that is meant to symbolize the relationship between Jesus and his bride, the church. A lot of people miss that our marriages as believers is meant to scream to the world about this beautiful relationship that Jesus has with his bride. All right, guys, I hope that encourages you and that you have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you soon.